Good afternoon, folks. Thank you so much for joining us today for Intro to Strategic Planning, Creating the Future of Your Nonprofit. This session is a part of our Integral Intro series where we provide an overview of foundational areas in nonprofit management. My name is Sandeep and I use she, her pronouns, and I will be hosting today's session. You can reach me at any time in the chat box. We'll begin today's session with a land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge that Integral Org is based out of Mohkinstsis, which is the Blackfoot name for elbow. This refers to the confluence of Elbow and Bow rivers that run through Treaty 7 territory. Mohkinstsis is situated in the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Siksika, Piikani, Kainai, as well as the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, consisting of the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. Mohkinstsis is also home to the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and finally the Métis Nation of Alberta District 5 and 6. At Integral Org, our team recognizes the existing tension between the legal and governance structures that we work within and efforts towards truth and reconciliation. And we accept our responsibility to work towards reconciling this tension. We all have a connection to the land and a responsibility to the land that hosts our lives, communities, and our work. With that, I would like to introduce today's facilitator, Mike Grogan. Mike is the president and CEO of Integral Org and has over 30 years of experience inspiring nonprofit organizations to tackle complex issues in creative and sustainable ways, all while understanding the dynamic needs of an organization and the nonprofit landscape. Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Sandeep, and thank you all. Always a pleasure to have you join us and to take time out of what I know are very busy schedules to sort of step back a bit and to learn. So my hope is that over this next hour that there are pieces that resonate with your organization. And as Sandeep says, if there's things that we just don't get to or you need more information, by all means do reach out. So this is what we're here for. Integral Org we're a charity and nonprofit, much like many of you. Our job is this. Our job is to come alongside organizations to equip them, to train them, to coach them, to help them get from here to there. And really, that's what strategic planning is. So today, I hope it's not just me talking. There'll be some chances for you to weigh in and to give your thoughts through a poll, maybe in the chat. We'll play a bit of whiteboard. We're going to test out the Zoom whiteboard, which is a bit of a challenge for us. It's our first time. So there you go, your guinea pigs. What do you know? So, but along the way, if there's questions, pop them in the chat. I mean, if you want to turn your camera on, put your hand up. Some people probably watch for that. But try, this is more about you getting what you need out of this. And there's a zillion ways to go, tons of information. We got more than we can present in an hour. So let's focus on the things that are important to you. Just, that strat planning really is it. We do have some control of where we go. Not total control, certainly. I think a lot of times in nonprofits, we underestimate how much control we have, but it's still at the same time, there's things that we feel that we're being blown about by forces that are perhaps not of our liking. So how do we find our way through that, knowing the environment we work within, and how do you break it down into these steps and processes that no matter the size or place of your organization, there's not one way to do this. So how do you do it that's something that's appropriate to you, that fits who you are and where you want to go? So it is what we do today that creates tomorrow, to recognize that was what planning does. It's starting to get a sense of crafting tomorrow. Whether or not we're entirely successful, that's probably not necessarily the point. We can do some things to take us from here to there. So today I want to talk about some things about the components of strat planning. There's lots of pieces to it. There's lots of great theories out there, lots of books. You can sort of go to town on all kinds of different, tools and processes and procedures. They all tend to fall into certain buckets, certain things you start to do from getting through the process, these things. But they're designed to sort of help you have a discipline, some structure, some format, and they do work within the idea of how we work within a changing environment. Because we don't work in we work in a very dynamic world, and so we need to sort of figure out how our thoughts today can be sort of moved forward 2, 3, 4 years. So some tools to do that, to understand where you're at today, your capacities and the external trends. We'll play with that a bit. One of my favorite things is understanding what's happening beyond our organizations. So I'm an economist by background. They do call that the dismal science. So a lot of the trends tend to be, ooh, that's not good. And maybe that's true. But what do you do with those things if that is in fact the case? And then how to keep strategy, because there is this idea that, strategic planning is something that kind of you get it done after 2 or 3 months and you say, woohoo, there we go. And we'll see you again in 3 years. Probably not the best way, definitely not the best way. Well, I was reading some stuff this morning, 70 to 90% of strat plans don't deliver on what they promise. And sometimes that what we promise is sort of overshooting. Sometimes it's just our lack of intentionality. Sometimes the world comes and kind of smacks us a bit and we're not able to do what we thought we might do. But how do we keep it front and center? How do you keep these things as a dynamic sort of ongoing piece and recognize that strat planning or strategy, that whole thing, they're not ends. They are means to an end. And we need to keep sure that we're keeping using them through the entire of our sort of operational life. So just some opening thoughts here. No matter where you're at, all organizations, size, focus, subsector, your lifespan, if you're brand new, if you're 50 years old, you do need some sort of roadmap to guide you. And I think you can make the argument, I suppose, well, good things are happening, we've got no plan, and you're able to capitalize on opportunity. And I think for a while that may work for you. But as you sort of move forward, or challenges come, or you get restrictions in terms of funding or programs or charitable purposes, which is a big lane where we need to stick within, you got to kind of narrow it down. So in the early days of a nonprofit, you kind of got this blue ocean. I can sail anywhere I want and do what I want. As you kind of move forward and sort of get more complex, get more people around you, more restrictions perhaps, you kind of got to narrow it down. And that's the tricky part. So in many ways, when we start out as a nonprofit, we have lots of ideas, lots of things we can do, lots of great things we can serve community, and great ways to maybe build our team or raise money. As you kind of move forward and mature, you kind of got to move from that ideas to strategies. And they're not disconnected. They're not even that much different. It's probably a little more discipline, a little more articulation. So either where you're at, you can sort of build a strategy based on who you are and where you're at in your lifespan or size of a nonprofit. Going back to the external environment, we don't plan inside a bubble. We sort of plan inside this world, which is always changing. I think we're well into recovery from sort of 2 or 3 years of disruption, both in the social disruption and the economic disruption that came with that, and then perhaps followed. But recovery does not mean restoration. It's not that we're heading back to where it was pre-COVID. And that's an important mindset piece for us to keep keep front and center, is to say, we're not trying to build towards something that was. We're trying to build towards something that might be or maybe will be. So not all organizations are coming out of COVID the same way. I think there's still a lot of lagging indicators out there. There's things that I thought would happen 2 years ago or a year ago in terms of the organizations thinking about maybe they're not longevity or maybe they're not viable. Seeing more of that in the last 6 months, perhaps more mergers than we thought we would see, more wind downs, more creative partnerships. At the same time, more growth too. So it's not that it's one or the other. It's just, I think some of those implications or some of those effects of a really disruptive time are still working their way through. And we're in a kind of a funny time in terms of, the overall economy. It feels like it is booming out there. Oil prices are high and let's say the sun is shining, but it was a minute ago. But it feels like things are on the upside. Yet it's not quite there yet. There's still lots of, funding is always tricky. I think labor force issues are tricky right now. So we need to recognize we plan in this environment. This is quite challenging, and I think will continue to challenge us for the next few years as we move forward here. And planning when things are uncertain is hard. I mean, it's tough to know if things are always changing. How do you plan in that changing world? You're kind of the shifting sand. You don't have your footing underneath you. You think, where's my next step or next 10 steps going to be? And sometimes that paralyzes us. We think, I can't quite feel the ground now, so I'm going to stay where I'm at. Or if I take a step, is it the right one? But there are ways to do that. There are ways to at least acknowledge the uncertainty, to sort of find ways to say, where are those certain or more certain places, not totally certain. There are ways to move forward. We'll give you some of those little bite-sized pieces, perhaps, that help us navigate such a challenging kind of world. So the question is, why do we need a strategy? We've had people come to us and say, I've done well. I've never had a strategy. The organization's grown, got people around me. Programs seem to be happening. And that's fair enough. I don't deny that's the way to go. I would, again, emphasize that it's probably not sustainable in the long run. And your strategy doesn't be a 20-page document. It doesn't have to be done with a big fancy consultant. It is just something that gives you that roadmap. And I'll give you a few reasons as to why we think that is important. What we're looking for, you can define strategic planning a million ways. You can define the process of them. And Absolutely. I mean, take what works for you. I like this one. This is from Balanced Scorecard. And Balanced Scorecard takes sort of the bigger strategy into some very concrete pieces written by Kaplan and years ago. It's a really nice, easy, accessible tool to make your strategy kind of active. And I'll give you some more content on that later on. But strategic planning is an organizational management process used to determine where an organization is going, the actions needed to make progress, and how you'll know it's successful. Really, at the end of the day, strategy is about getting from A to B. A is where you're at today, and that goes. A lot of stuff goes into that A. It's your history, the way your organization is structured, your charitable purposes, maybe your funding models, your program, the people around you, all those kind of things. So it's both that point in time today and the things that lead up to it. And B is just some point in the future, or some place in the future. But usually we kind of measure it by a time. A lot of times, years ago, you're probably doing 5-year strat plans. Today, we're, 2 years ago during COVID, we were doing 6-month strat plans. 3 is kind of a nice middle number. But again, no magic. We're not trying to predict, from today to 3 years out from today, this is what we'll do. You're having an informed and more than a best guess, but you're never going to predict it all. So you had this idea, we're at A, we've got a good understanding of that, we're going to B, and what are the steps in the middle? And that's what strategy is. There's no one way to connect A to B. So we figure out what's one of those sort of lane ways you want to work within. And if they're not working, then we adjust. And we adjust the strategies, or we adjust this point called B somewhat. Okay. So it's nothing, these are all things you can break down. It does not have to be an overwhelming process. It's something that's got to fit you. So there's a lot of approaches. Find one that fits you. Don't sort of lock into saying that I read a book or some other organization hired a $100,000 consultant from one of the big accounting firms. If that fits you and that's your style, fantastic. But don't let that be daunting for you. There's a lot of people. It's tough to find supports for these things. I'll give some of the ways that we do this stuff, but by no means I'm sort of pitching our services. There's lots of great help out there. So find an approach that fits you. And that may be sort of dependent upon your organizational size, your structure. Do you have a really active board? Is your board kind of distant? You don't do much. Do you want to involve your clients? So that kind of fits who you are. So how you're structured, what you do, the types of programs. If you're running 50 programs, it's maybe a little more complex than you have one program. Your funding structures and the levels. There's a part of me that acknowledges, and we all should, that a lot of times of what we call strategy is sort of dependent upon what we currently do, the kind of services and programs we offer, and how much money we might have or expect to have. And those are two pretty big components of it. There's nothing wrong with that. But if that's all it is, it probably doesn't really stretch this too far. But they're really important. We can't ignore that we live in a world where there is limited amounts of funding. We have lots of dreams and lots of needs. And to not take those into account in our funding model tend to be mistakes. And one of the things we'd see probably when we're working with really small organizations, like startup organizations that maybe are not even incorporated yet, and they're kind of dreaming about the future. We do quite a few exercises. We say, we're going to be in 3 or 4 years. Small organizations tend to overshoot where they're going to be. They have bigger dreams and they're able to pull off, which is fine. Big organizations tend to be a little more conservative because you've got more to protect. So that funding piece and who you are and your structure and the history of your organization kind of plays into not just what you'll do in terms of strategy, but this overall, how do we create this vision for where we're going? And is it too big, too little, or is the Goldilocks world just right, I suppose? The types of stakeholders are out there. Again, there's some parts of the nonprofit world where funders are super active and they want to have a role in sort of saying where you're going. Sometimes that's non-existent at all. Sometimes you have members or clients or family members of clients that may want to weigh in on this kind of stuff. Past board members, founders, things like that. So those things you got to sort of think, okay, how does that fit us and how do we involve them or not within the planning process? One of our sort of guiding principles is we like planning to be inclusive. And for those for whom the plan matters, which may be your clients or your stakeholders, should have a voice in there somewhere. That can be done through a proxy. But how do you get enough voices in to make sure that you're getting enough information so you can make an informed choice? And again, the external operating environment. If you're planning 2 years ago or you're planning in COVID, tough to make a plan. Today, a little more stability out there. So you don't want to ignore the external operating environment as we plan. I want to just jump to this. And this is a bit of a poll for us here, just to get a sense of where you're at. So Cindy's going to walk us through a poll. And this is just does your organization currently have a strategic plan that meaningfully guides your work. So the poll pops up there. I think that's straightforward, is it not, Sandeep? Anything else we need to do with this one?
Nope, just it should be on the screen. We have folks putting
Nope.
them in their results now.
Oh, look at that. It's like a dynamic sort of real time. There we go. So we have the answers in, you've read them all. Yes, we use it all the time. Yeah, we use it sometimes, we use it often. We don't have one. I don't know if we have one or not. I always love that answer because I'm sure we probably think we do or don't. Let's share this one, Cindy. Is it sharing? There we go. Okay.
Should be on the screen now.
A nice mix, right? So, we use it sometimes, 22%. Use it often, 43. Fantastic. I mean, that's a good indicator that you're not just doing this work, that you are actually, it's guiding something, at least to some degree. Or we don't have it. And I'd say probably a fairly common mix of responses. So no wrong answer here. Just because you don't know, you don't have one, that's not the point. It's the idea we're all at different places, and there may be great reasons for those being at different places. So as we move forward again, I think there'll be something in all this. Oh, there, now it's being shared. Now I'm going to stop sharing it. There we go. I have no idea how polls actually work. So just to say that part, just so you know, a lot of the technology stuff. That's why Sandeep's here.
If you're ready for it to move away, you can just close it on your screen.
Yeah. Just why we do this, though. Back to why we do this kind of stuff. Just the idea, it does identify and articulate your organization's focus and priorities. And that's the main thing. It's very much strategy is a team game. And so, if I sort of think, where does Integral Org need to go? We're a charity, nonprofit like you folks. If I think I know we're going to go, that's not the same as Sandeep and I sort of figuring that out, or our board sitting with us, or our board and staff team. So it's not just that one person can identify where they want to go, it's a collective. And that's a hard thing to do because you got to then sort of put a bunch of stuff on the table and negotiate, go back and forth, and find that piece that says collectively we're heading towards this place. And these are our priorities. So much different than just doing it by yourself. That then allows us to say we're going to where are we going to spend our time and energy? You've got limited resources. Their time is precious, money is precious, bandwidth for nonprofits in terms of being out there in that giant environment of all the nonprofits out there is challenging. So where is the best use of our time and resources and energy? So strategy gives you at least some guidance to say, let's go here, not here. Again, making sure we're all aligned this way, staff, board, volunteers, we know where we're going. That's can happen in multiple ways, either through the process itself or out sharing a plan afterwards and finding a place for people to find themselves in that plan. Plans that are created with people are probably way better than those who are sort of done external to people or distant from people. But even if you do that, you say, you got to find a place, say, how can they, how do you share ownership of this? How do you share that this is something that's all about us and just not my plan that I expect you to execute for me? So the idea of ownership amongst those who are going to be enacting or living through the plan over the years is super important. Again, it tells us a bit about outcomes. Sometimes they're depending on how you write your plan, but it does some agreement where we're heading. If we're planning on diversifying our revenue and the more concrete you are in your outcomes or your measurements, I think it does give you some objective. Are we heading it? Are we making it or not? If I want to double my revenue, well, that's a pretty concrete thing. My plan says in 3 years I'm going to do it. I've got something to shoot towards. And it allows me to say, am I making progress? I'm getting where I want to go. Other parts of it are probably not as measurable. I want to create a healthy staff environment. You can measure some of that, but it's a little more abstract. But it does give us something to sort of gauge ourselves against, both in terms of where we are today and where we'd like to be. So that's what we want to do, is we want to assess where we're at and make adjustments along the way. When we write strategies, we're not saying we're going to get them all right. It is that these are our best understanding of the way to move forward today. We'll put a mechanism in place to say, is this working for us? And if not, we will readjust if things change along the way. At the end of the day, we're heading for something like this. We are heading towards a strategic plan. This is from a guy named David LaPiana. They do some great work on sort of planning and mergers and alliances, all that kind of stuff. A strategic plan is a coordinated set of actions designed to create and sustain a competitive advantage in achieving our missions. I like this a lot. It's got some things that aren't probably common for nonprofits, but it's got some neat stuff in it too. So that coordinated set of actions, when you write strategies, you might have 2, 3, 4, 5 areas. They don't sit apart from each other. They're not just sort of disconnected pillars about people, money, programs, profile, infrastructure. Things tend to fall into those kind of buckets. But they do align with each other. When you're writing a plan about your people and the way you want to engage or work with or hire or grow your staff or board complement, You can't disconnect that from the program side or the financial side. So these do integrate. They are a coordinated set of actions, but designed to create and sustain a competitive advantage. We don't talk about competitive advantage much in the nonprofit sector. This is not the idea that you need to be competitive. It's not you need to go tromp on somebody. There's winners and losers. There probably are, but it's not your intent necessarily. It is to how do you elevate yourself? We're going to get into what we call an industry analysis piece here, but why should somebody choose your programs, services, offerings, performances above someone else's? And as much as we all think we're unique, we are not. There are other options out there. There's other ways of doing things. There's other sort of opportunities for folks. If Integral org went away tomorrow, I hope we don't, but something else would rise up to fulfill the void in the world that we do. There's always things changing. So this plan is to say, why us? And it keeps a little more maybe a hard look at ourselves to say, okay, this is what we're really good at. This is what we need the world to see. So the plan gives you something that makes that really concrete and makes it, at least gives you some indication of what makes our stuff really special. So how do we get there? How do you write such things as a plan? Lots of ways to go. Don't be beholden to any one of them, but I'll give you some of the basic concepts. Lots of ways to go, numeral styles. I think using a defined process, it helps. Whether that process is, I don't necessarily care, but use some process, because I think what we need a process for, and that process can be big or small, but it gives us some intentionality. It gives us some focus and some discipline that you don't get if you sort of just do little chunks here and there. If you only pick and choose the good parts of a plan, you don't ignore where you got to sort of do some sort of background work or fix some things up in a house before you build on the next story. You need something to sort of push you a bit more. So whether that's an external person or a book or a template or a process, doesn't really matter. Something that pushes you beyond what you do by yourself or as a board or a staff team. Because there are choices to make. And one of the hardest things, and I think it is one of the most challenging parts of doing strategy, is saying no. I think a lot of times we will have, and we're as guilty of this as anybody, we sort of keep our options open. We want to be nimble. We want to be responsive. We want to be adaptive. Those are great values. But if it is that we sort of get blown back and forth by the wind, and to say we sort of chase the next bright, shiny object or funding source or program, I don't think that's strategy. And there's ways to be successful without strategy. But the idea of saying no to certain things, saying, if I say yes to that, I have to say no to something else. That idea of scarcity is important, to say I have limited time, limited energy, limited bandwidth. How do I make the right choices? And that's a tough one, especially as things get tougher out there. I think, maybe I should do something that doesn't quite fit where I want to go, but it keeps the doors open. I understand those tensions. But the idea of saying no, and at least putting the question up, should we or should we not do this on the table, is super important. And again, to remember that planning and strategic plans are means to an end. They are not ends of themselves. There's no magic of writing a plan that just sits there that looks really good or sounds really good or doesn't maybe, but it's the idea they need to get you somewhere, and that's why it needs to be sort of ongoing and dynamic. Lots of ways to do this. Most of them sort of come down to a cycle of preparing. So you don't just sort of, we're starting to plan today. There's probably a background, a little bit of understanding where you're at today, visioning where we're going, planning, and evaluation. Those are kind of the big pieces of it, and I'll touch on all of these. Understanding your current state, your organization, industry you work within, which may be the nonprofit sector, but likely smaller than that, into a smaller group of organizations, the external environment, and the desired future. Those are the four big sort of lane ways or steps along the planning piece, not so much lane ways. Then beyond that, it's establishing the goals, priorities, and action steps. How do you make it really relevant? Thing like the balanced scorecard card thing. I'll give you a couple other tools to help you do that. And then how do you revise this? And that's where it is really important. Probably the step we don't do enough on is to say, okay, how do we make sure we're looking back at this? And whether it's annually or every month or whatever it might be, how do we have a process that says the check-in? So we don't just do 3 years from now and say, how did we do? Or look at things 3 years from now. It should be something that we're coming back to and revising and adapting as we go forward. One of the metaphors or tools or things we like to use, because I like pictures, is this is what we call the strategy funnel. And there's nothing magical about this, but it is the idea that as you sort of go through this process, and this may be, we've had people phone us and say, hey, we're meeting next Saturday. Can you write a strat plan for us? And we say, well, you don't write a strat plan on a Saturday or any one day, not so much Saturdays. It is just that there is an art to having enough time to sort of get information and insights and pieces of data on the table and then work them through to what are actually called strategies, that sort of pointy edge of the wedge here. So there's no set how long this takes, but it's a bit of balance between creating some energy momentum and then letting things percolate a bit. Because a lot of these stuff doesn't just sort of happen because you write a sticky note and throw it on a whiteboard. You kind of got to think this stuff through. So we tried to work with this idea of this awareness. We get a whole bunch of ideas on the table, whether they're connected or not, whether they're sort of heretical, doesn't really matter. Let's get a whole bunch of stuff on the table that we're going to play with, and then work you through a process to say, how do we pick and choose and throw some out and mix some together and sort of think, okay, now we're starting to see those threads starting to emerge. We're going to synthesize some things. To then we get to the point where we can write strategies. Now we get into the 2 or 3 or 4 buckets of strategy that these are what we want to write. So some time in here. It's the idea when I say about getting ideas or stakeholders' voices at the table, this is why it's important. If you just write what I think is important, you're not getting all those bubbles. It's not wide enough. You need a lot more data or pieces or grist for the mill or recipe ingredients, whatever you want to call it, to throw in there before we get down to that pointy edge, which are called strategies. Just want to think too, there's a different concept. We could spend a lot of time on this, but to put on, it's different to sort of work and think strategically. And yeah, it's a bit of the sort of Albert Einstein. You'd have had an hour to solve a problem. I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about it. And it is a bit of a personality thing. It's a bit of maybe the a bit of thought on that our time is limited and getting people together to do this stuff is tough. But to slow ourselves down. And so we do slow people down, at least the front end of strategy, to start to think about things that aren't necessarily problem solving. We're really good at problem solving. You run a nonprofits, and people who work and run nonprofits are pretty good at making things happen or solving things. That's a part of it. We don't want to ignore that. But it's the idea, how do we back up and start to really calm ourselves down and to discern and to listen? So that strategic thinking, where it's that exploration, it's intuition, it's creativity. It can be tough for people because it's not really abstract. We're not getting stuff done. So if you're kind of rubber meets the road kind of person, that kind of stuff is really challenging. But it allows us not to move too quickly towards solutions, which strategies tend to be. And so we try to balance these things where we're getting enough thought and insight on the table, we wrestle with some things, and then we start to plan. So just some different ways of thinking about things. Goes back to the funnel a bit, but it'll also fit in with some of the components of strategy that we're going to put on the table here as we move forward. So, and those sort of building blocks of process, and you can call this a whole bunch of different things, but we start with this A, where we're at today, and that's kind of, know your capacity, know how strong you are today, know where you're at in a really honest and I think, probably comprehensive and commonly held understanding. It does nobody any good if the board thinks the organization is just rocking it financially and has got great, everything's going for it, and the staff going to go, no, we're almost bankrupt and we hate each other. So we need to get on that same page and say, where are we really at? And every organization has strengths and weaknesses. There's none of us that sort of have it all nailed, but to know where we're really starting from. We've done projects with organizations where we got hired to come in and do put a new program in place, or an organization had one core program, got some funding, wanted to put a whole new program in place. Fantastic. As we're going through it, you think, Jesus, things aren't just clicking here. There's something wrong. So we went back and did an organizational assessment and realized, you're almost bankrupt. You got no community presence, and the board is kind of just falling apart. So he said, maybe we should go back and fix the foundations of the house before we put the second story on. So that knowing your capacity is not just important and dramatic like that, where you probably weren't going to be successful in the program, but you got to kind of start with where I'm at today. Where's my battery? Am I full? Am I empty? That kind of stuff. A lot of ways to do this. You can do this. It's that commonly held part of it's really important. So you're all on the same page, and you may not agree, but you can say, yeah, okay, I don't think we're quite that poor off on programming, but maybe other people do. So I got to put that sort of thought in my head. The idea that, we don't just assess once and then we go forward. We think people should assess the organizational strengths and capacities at least annually, like a checkup, kind of thing. You should probably go get checked out every now and then, not just the 3 or 4 years like some people might do with doctors, that kind of stuff. Lots of ways to assess your capacity, lots of ways to look. I think there's some that are better than worse. The idea of a SWOT. And if you've done any planning at all, you've probably come across a SWOT: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It is that way of just asking people, where are we really strong? What do we really do well? Where do we really rock this thing? Conversely, where do we have areas to grow? What's challenging us? Those are more internal pieces. Those are the ones from inside the house. This is what's really going well and what's not. Opportunities and threats are more external, outside the organization. What's coming up that we might want to explore? What are the opportunities out there? What What might we want to consider, if not necessarily embrace in our plan? And well, conversely, what might threaten us? Like what's out there saying, well, maybe we know these things, maybe we don't. And what do we need to think about? Because again, we don't plan within a vacuum. I think it's a really simple tool. You don't need anybody to help you with this. You can do it. The limitations of a SWOT, if you're sitting around with a board and staff team doing this, and it's unlikely the staff's going to say, one of our weaknesses is that board. They don't do anything. Probably don't get the depth of this kind of stuff. So, there are some, advantages and disadvantages. Easy, accessible, really easy to do this one. Can do it anytime you want. Maybe not getting the fulsome picture because it might be too much of that sort of surface kind of stuff. There's other tools out there. We do one that's organizational assessment when we're doing planning. This is one, it's an online survey. It's done anonymously. We parse it by board, staff, volunteers, however you want to do it. But what it does is it allows us to maybe do a little more deeper dive into some of those core areas you might get through a SWOT. But you get, you get more honest ratings. So if the one person's saying this, another person that, it's just a data point. It's not a comment in a sticky board where you're sort of looking at somebody going or not looking at somebody when they do something. So probably a little more objective. And the point is not to write in a report card. It's not saying you're good or bad. It's to say, this is a self-assessment. This is what we think collectively. And the idea of doing this collectively, both in the good and the bad, the places that are, we're strong at and the places we're not, really need to be on the table. There's some of these that are kind of online you can do. We're looking at developing an open access one with our partners in Edmonton. We're still a ways away from that, getting money and then building it. But other than that, we're close. But I think this is an area that the sector could do well at, to sort of have this ongoing sort of assessment of where we're at and individually. And then if you roll it up, you're probably not a bad data point for the sector. So know your capacity, know how strong you are. Don't fall in love with the image you have of yourself. Be a little more, not cutthroat, but a little more honest and upfront, and sort of that look in the mirror and say, okay, now I know where I'm starting from before I start planning. The second thing is to know the industry you're within Alberta. So where you work. So some folks here beyond Alberta, I suppose. But we don't talk about the industry a lot. We talk about the sector a lot, but I think you need to break it down. The sector is kind of a really whole bunch of organizations. And the industry is kind of more the people I compete with. So or more I work alongside. Children's services, disabilities, those are industries in the sort of economics mindset. But I want you to sort of think about this, the nonprofit sector. And you use the chat if you can. And if you can take a look at the chat, you're going to put a number into the chat for me. And you're going to answer this question. How many nonprofits are currently active in Alberta? So I should probably pull up the chat so I can actually see answers. But you think about Alberta, 4.5 million folks, maybe more than that. But how many nonprofits are there? And I always intrigued by these answers. Let me scroll. 10,000. Thank you, Chris. Nice to see you again. Glad you're here. Helen, 360. One for almost every day of the year. Fantastic. So many. Excellent answers. 17,000, 6,600. Great. We're all over the place. The answer is this. The answer is we probably don't know exactly. Thank you, Matthew. About 30,000 would be my number. And that would include organizations that are incorporated in Alberta, 28 to 1,000 or so now. But then there's federally incorporated ones too. So the numbers are tough out there. Alberta likely has more nonprofits per capita, certainly anywhere else in Canada, probably anywhere else in North America, maybe anywhere else in the world. Data's pretty tricky in the nonprofit sector, so that one's a bit made up. But still, it's a good point. The idea that we have a lot of nonprofits. Every year in Alberta, 12 to 1,500 probably new nonprofits are incorporated just in Alberta. Forget the federal ones, they still work here. That's a lot of new nonprofits. That's a lot of people in your industry. You might think you're unique and you're going to have causes that are just about you. That's fantastic. But the idea that you're in a very competitive landscape, no matter what we're doing, we're not all unique. And so there's only limited supply of people, money, bandwidth. I can't name 30,000 nonprofits and no one can. That's why competitive advantage, that idea, what raises above all these other people, that's why that statement's really important. So the idea that there are people out there like us, 30,000 nonprofits, 1 in 20 people work for it. There's a lot of stuff happening in the nonprofit sector. It's a big industry, but we're not all unique within that. So understand that when you're starting a nonprofit, you think it's a great idea. I'm sure it is. Funders had that idea 20 times yesterday. So that's why we need to sort of think about who else is out there in that same world. They're not all spread around, so you're not competing with everybody. So in those 30,000 nonprofits, a lot of them still in religion, and that's kind of shrinking. 10, 15 years ago, that's probably 25%. You're seeing different denominations. You're seeing the collapse of sort of rural churches maybe rolling into one organization rather than 10. So things like that. Sports and rec, fundraising. So I get the breakdown. So you're not competing against all these folks, but if you were to start an arts and culture organization doing drama, there's going to be people doing stuff out there that are quite similar to yourself. So those are just things to think about. You don't have to make your plan to sort of, be adversarial to them, but you can't ignore them either as you move through this kind of stuff. So this industry analysis, and there's some tools that we have as long as we can point you to, it just, your understanding of your position relative to other companies, so a bit more corporate, but fair enough, that produce similar products and services, right? So again, it's not just about us, it's not about the external environment, it's not about funding, it's about the other players in the sector, and to have a fairly good understanding of who they are, where you align, where you don't align. There's some pretty simple questions you can ask yourself, things like, what are your primary areas of activity? Are we working in Calgary? Are we in certain programs? Is the demand, is it going up or down? Who else offers these services? Are there barriers to entry? If you're in a place where you got to have housing, you got to put up apartment buildings, that's a pretty big barrier to entry. If you're doing something that anybody can show up tomorrow and start doing street performances, well, there's skill involved, obviously, but the barrier to entry is perhaps lower. So those are things when we think about the competitors, the complements, or the substitutes in an industry, we need to think about. Who else out there has advantages that we have or disadvantages that perhaps we don't have? What's happening in this sector? What are the key future opportunities? We did a session for some folks who are work with natural gas, buying natural gas co-ops, or these buy gas from co-op in Alberta. And one of the things they have to wrestle with is, do we exist in 10 years? Like, what are the opportunities and challenges out there? Are fossil fuels on the decline? Is natural gas going to decrease? And so you don't necessarily know the answer to that, but you've got to start thinking about not just who's around today, but where's the whole industry going? If you're a children's service agency, well, probably less children 20 years out from now there today. If you're in seniors, a lot more seniors. Those are industry questions where you're sort of thinking about not just the current state of the industry, but where that industry is going. And the next point is be aware of the external environment. I think Sandeep won't do the jam or the whiteboard here today. We're just, one of us is rambling on too long, just so we're aware of that. To be aware of the external environment, and this is the idea that we don't work in the vacuum. We understand the things that are out there in the external environment that might affect us. So this is another simple one. If you've done planning, it's a pest analysis. Actually, we'll do the whiteboard. I think we're okay. Making stuff up. That's the adaptive planning stuff. You adjusted, you came back, it's fantastic. That's an example for you. What are the pest analysis is, again, like the SWOT. It's just letters that form a word, except a real word this time. It's what are the political, economic, social, and technological factors that might impact your organization? So very simple. It's just, if I'm thinking right now politically, well, it's okay. There's an election coming up in a year or so. How is that going to affect us? Federal, for some organizations, federal elections are really big. Other times, provincial elections are much bigger. So it's not just about elections. There's all kinds of sort of ideological stuff out there, or ways people engage, economic kind of stuff. We're going up, we're going down, those kind of things, social, technological, those kind of things. You're not trying to sort of predict things, but to be aware of what's going to happen, not just today, but 2, 3, 4, 10 years down the road that we might not think about. So a pest is one way to do that. There's things we do, environmental stands for organizations sometimes, where we do the analysis. We'll take a look at things like inflation or housing or data or donation trends, things like that. But they don't all affect us the same. So if I'm an organization that is heavily reliant on donations or wants to be reliant on donations, I need to understand what's happening in donations. So donations, by and large, have either remained flat overall in Canada for the last 10 or so years, but probably more concentrated in big charities. 30 years ago, maybe 30% of folks would claim a charitable donation on their tax return. We're now down to about 17% claiming a donation. Doesn't mean that people aren't donating. It's even less people are donating or claiming a donation. They're concentrating in big charities, and people are maybe giving it other ways. They're not doing it through their tax returns. They're getting charitable receipts. But it's in a changing environment. One of the things that just, is always surprising to me, that's not that it's wrong. It's just, years ago, you had a way in Calgary to do some cuts to funding, and it was because they couldn't raise enough money, and so they cut some of their agencies. And one of the responses, people would say, well, I'm going to go hire my own fundraiser. And I think, okay, if the United Way with a fundraising machine can't raise money, what makes you think you can do it? It's the environment that was challenging, not necessarily the skill they had. So things like that, just to prompt us these things. So how do we know they're going to affect us? And then how do we monitor shifts? Because things can change pretty quick. the external environment sometimes shifts overnight and you can't do much about it. But if something happens, how are we going to respond? So that external world, super, super important to go forward here. I'm going to get you to play with a couple of things. I'm going to turn to Sandeep to walk us through, just a bit of a pest now. We're going to play with the pest. We're going to do the whiteboard here. So Sandeep, walk us through this, baby.
Sure. Just launching it here. And it should be on the screen now. Just going to move this up here. So, folks, you can interact with this just as I am. The thing that you want to be aware of is that you're clicked onto the cursor here, which is the first icon to the left in that toolbar there. And then you can click into these sticky notes and enter your text, scroll down to the bottom two sections here so that you can participate in all 4 of these sections. So feel free, hop in whenever you're ready to
click on a sticky note and just, economics, what's happening in economics, you might be out there, or what's happening in, perhaps social trends, or, those kind of things that, what do you think's affecting maybe your organization or the sector as a whole? So if you're able to, really hope you're able to now, but it worked for me. Oh, there, the UCP. Excellent. We can unpack that one a bit, perhaps. Social factors. There's some great things happening. There's certainly on the social issues, diversity, equity, inclusion kind of stuff is an interesting one. And again, they may not affect us all independently equally, but it's good to sort of have these. New technology. Excellent. Yeah. Housing market. Yeah, housing. I think, when you look at some of those economic ones, housing probably is, not just for service delivery and nonprofits, but staffing. Like if your staff cannot get housing, what do you do? Those things. And you look at some of the data coming forward, how long it's going to take us to get back to an affordable housing market, to get to one, and really get back to it. I'm not sure we ever had that for decades. But the idea of getting to an affordable housing market is tough for us, The election cycles on the political side, fantastic. You always got to be, we did a strat plan years ago for a group, just over 5 years ago. It was a group in harm reduction. They were doing safe supervised consumption work, and they were $2 million. They thought they were going to go to 15 because the NDP was in power. They were heading down harm reduction. Kind of started the plan pre-election, finished the plan post-election. UCP gets in, and they're still a $2 million agency because harm reduction came off the agenda of that government. So political ideologies and political will really plays into the nonprofit world a lot of times in ways that perhaps you don't expect. Loneliness, interesting economic factor. I'd like to unpack that one a bit. Yeah, so you can scroll up and down, and Sandeep, just sort of let us stop sharing here as well. Pick on a few more to sort of think about as we do this thing. So I go to presentation mode, and the Alberta recovery model. There you go. So the idea that it's the recovery model, I assume that's what we're talking about here. There's a lot of ways to interpret sticky notes. Election cycles, UCP, NORS. Don't know what that means, but it could be. They're twice. Probably really important. Economic factors, lack of revenue is fantastic. It's always one of the cases, and that's why we have to make choices in this thing. New government economic agenda, and you're never quite sure what it's going to be, right? In some ways. Scroll down a bit. Donations, fantastic, up and down. Funders adjusting their mandate in their social programs. I think, we're in the social, there we go. Funders adjusting their mandate. That's really important. You do see that, certainly community foundations, a lot more into the equity, inclusion, diversity, recovery kind of stuff. Excellent, their choice, but that sort of shifts the model, right? And that shifts the model for everybody else. There's a limited supply. So if funders change what they do, that changes some of our stuff. Now, lots of, loneliness there too. So, all kinds of good stuff there. And technology, we didn't get much of that. That's one that is constantly moving forward, both in ways that are going to challenge us, because sometimes it's tough for nonprofits to really embrace or work with technology, but probably easier ways to do it too. There's ones that are accessible. There's lots of great free or almost free technology platforms out there, ways of enhancing. We went to monday.com for our project management and doing a lot of stuff, and it's a game changer for us and free licensing. So there's things that you can do to embrace it. We could have a whole session on AI, the pros and cons, dangers, that kind of stuff. We'll stop. We won't do that today, though. So that's just a really quick kind of taking a look at, what is sort of out there in terms of the big world of sort of future trends. So I just need to make things work again here somehow. Great. So we've sort of done some work on understanding where we're at, the industry we're at, we work within, kind of the external stuff. We've got some of these, the funnel's got all these data points. Now we need to start thinking about where we're going. And, it's the idea of like getting something that sort of articulates that B that we're going to. We're going from A to B. How do we start to think about that? In lots of ways, you can make that really grand. Again, a lot of it's not, it's a lot of it's shaped by where we come from. You're not saying that the place we're at in a few years is totally different from where we're at today. If you're a charity, you've got charitable purposes. If you're a nonprofit, you got objects. Those are things you need to pay attention to because you can't just sort of do this 180-degree turn because you kind of got some laneways. If you're good at doing something, you've got demand for it, that kind of sets you down that path. So in many cases, the future is not dramatically different than today. It is today, right? So we sort of start with today. We don't sort of get away from that. So, but the aspirations, the purposes, the reality of the work, and then that kind of determines where we're going to go in the future. Sometimes it's good to really dream, though. We really push people to sort of not just do what you're good at or how much more money you're going to have or sort of incremental steps. If that's what you want to do, that's perfect. But can we push you to sort of dream a bit bigger? What might take you to scale, perhaps, or might take you to new areas or new ways of working that we wouldn't think about today? So part of the planning process is to use this envisioning the future to push ourselves a bit. Whether or not that becomes the final version, that's okay. Good to push yourself dreaming wise a bit better than dial it back than to undershoot and not be satisfied by where you're going or missing opportunities. And one of the hardest thing about dreaming about the future is we got to make decisions today. We got to make some decisions. We don't know about the future. If I'm saying we're going to be in 3 years, Mike, I know I'd like to be in 3 years. I know where I think I should be, but I really don't know. So we don't have all that information. We need to make decisions. That's why doing some of that pre-work gives at least a foundation to have an informed choice that isn't just a wild guess. We're not just sort of making things up. So in most cases, the future is pretty aligned with, or if not, it's different than the past. The 3 years from now, you may not think like 3 years from last. This probably has changed. But in the normal world, 3 years isn't a lot of period of time. And sometimes things don't tend to change. But you sort of think back and think, oh, bit by bit, things do change. You've got different people, maybe a funding source, maybe a program, where you work. Things do change a lot. So sort of that balance that there's a security in where we come from and still to push ourselves, things might be a bit different. You can use some prompts. You can sort of use your tools to sort of dream big. We do some envisioning the future. We work with what's called an ambition statement sometimes. You can do scenario planning, which sort of filling with different visions of the future, that some are good and some are bad. We're not trying to predict the future. We're trying to sort of think about the future, going back to that strategic thinking slide to say, let's think about it before we start to plan towards it. So you can use that sort of start, stop, continue. What are we doing now? We continue. What should we stop doing? What should we add to the mix? That sort of big, very audacious goal, saying, okay, maybe it's time for us to put a big stake in the ground and try something. Put the ideas out there, play with them. Easier to draw it back if you're going too far. Sustainability analysis is another tool that can be used to say, how do we sort of maximize the program mix we have now? Sustainability is that ability to sort of create some, value for today without sacrificing the future. And it's based on the model that we develop and mature and cycle out of programs, both on a financial and programmatic side for the overall benefit of the organization. A little more complex, but a nice tool to have because not every program should stay around forever. I like the idea of being inclusive, and this is the idea that for whom does the program or the work matters should have a voice in this. Adam Catane, one of the sort of most underrated Canadians in terms of scenario planning and systems thinking, has sort of 3 sort of visions for how you solve problems. It is to be emergent. You're never going to get the whole thing down. To be systemic, you look at the whole picture. But to be participatory, you involve people in the decision. So that goes back to the funnel again. You get a lot of voices, a lot of stuff in there. So emergent, participatory, systemic, that kind of helps us think about the future if we're moving forward. Then you refine it to it fits. It's not just saying, okay, we're going to do this, write it down once on a big sticky note and you're done. You kind of got to refine it, make sure it fits you, make sure it fits the collective of who you are, not just one person along the way. So he's put this stake in the ground, that's where we're going. And the strategy is sort of getting from here to there. And that's the next piece, the last piece of the equation, perhaps. It's creating the plan. And the plan is we're here, we're going to climb a mountain, change metaphors, A at the bottom, B at the top. Yeah, same metaphor, there you go. So the idea of how do we get from here to there? And the idea, you don't do it all at once. You got to sort of figure it out along the way. So you sort of start from the bottom of the slide here, the short term. This is if you're climbing Everest, you got some links to go. We're going to go from this camp to this camp, then from this camp to this camp. So you've kind of divided up into legs. You're not trying to write a plan that sort of says, I know every day for the next 3 years. You're breaking it down to manageable pieces. And the shorter the piece, the more concrete it is, the more we understand it. The longer the piece, the more abstract it gets. We got to adjust. So those short-term goals is kind of those little sections of rock. I got a handheld here, here, and here. The longer-term activities is sort of we're going up it, and that big one to get us to the top. I know my entire route, but I'm going to adjust along the way. So the idea of parsing it off into shorter, more manageable chunks, more concrete in the short end, longer, more abstract as they get longer, and adjusting as we go. So it's not just I'm going to diversify my revenue. We're going to break it down into more bite-sized pieces, and some great tools to help with this. This is an example. This is an example of a strat plan that sort of gives you some pieces. This is something that we sort of meshed together from a few different places. Quite common. It's saying we're going to continue to diversify funding streams to improve sustainability and increase discretionary funds. So a little bit of concrete in that first one, but then some more concrete pieces. So the big one's that kind of grander strategy. We're going to explore social enterprise opportunities by developing a commercial kitchen, long-term funding strategy, get into fund development. They didn't have any of that at this point, and then that culture of philanthropy for the staff. So some bite-sized pieces that get you to that overall piece. So one that's kind of just massaged a bit for you to give you some idea of a big strategy with some more intermediate or shorter term actions they can take. And then you can break each of those down. If it's a commercial kitchen, okay, when are we going to do it? Who's going to do it? What's the budget? All those kind of things. One of the problems is with planning, or one of the, not the problem or not, but it's one of the ongoing dynamics is that, we sort of get to that point where you think, I'm done. How do I make this real? And so bridge span, which is other states, and most of our material come from Canada, but on these process ones, this is some good stuff. Bridge span is a capacity building organization, lots of free resources, easy to use. But how do you live into it? How do you make sure your plan doesn't just sit in the shelf and sort of gather dust? How do you actually concretely break it down into actionable steps? And so this is at the end that we've often heard a collective sigh of relief when the planning process is done, and you think, whew, we're finally done. And I get that. When we're done a strat plan, I go, whew, fine, thank goodness, sufficient. But it's not it. It's just it's the first step of the journey, and you got to keep it going. And that's why it's not an end; it's a means to an end. So the idea we've done some of the hard work, but how do we get the best value out of it? We're not quite across the line yet. So there's some things you can do. We can break it down into, you take those big strategies, you translate to goals and activities, create the blueprint, you mobilize the team, you get your finances in place, you kind of monitor your progress and revisit and repeat. And I'll give you just a picture of it. It's kind of blurry here, but this is from the bridge span work as well. They've got templates for this. You don't have to recreate the wheel. It's already out there for you. If you said, I've got this overall strategy, how do I make it real? How do I implement it? They've got templates and tools, and these come through, how you sort of list who's going to be involved, what their accountabilities are, what for the board, for the staff, a timeline or a funding plan. So Bridgespan has a lot of this stuff. There's other places too if you want. Balanced scorecard's another tool that takes a strategy and makes it into goals and then measurement pieces. A little more involved, but doesn't have to be. So the idea of not just leaving them really big, but getting them to really bite-sized pieces. And this is where it both builds in the accountability piece. It certainly gets in the involvement. So for staff members to say, okay, now I see how my stuff fits with its overall plan. It seems a little vague at the top. How am I going to increase discretionary funding? If I do this and this, I'm playing the game with you. So some great tools out there. If these work for you, certainly use them. If not, then don't worry about it. There's other stuff out there too. So just remember that we need to align to the day-to-day, the nuts and bolts. We're sort of got our head down doing work with these overall visions. We got to find somebody to connect those things. Processes, templates, tools, having the topics at meetings, having conversations, putting in a board report does kind of keep it front and center for us. So making sure that when we're doing it, it's not just disconnected from the reality of our data work. And that may be very unique for each organization, but there are some ways with those templates and other ways to sort of do that. But be disciplined about it too. Sometimes you sound like a broken record. Coming back to our strategy. Oh, great on that conversation of strategy, Mike. That's fantastic. No, it is. So got to find more creative ways to do it. But the idea about you got to return to it. You got to keep coming back to it. If you spent the time doing this and doing it well, then it is something that should give you some guidance and drive your work as you move forward. Just a couple of closing thoughts. I'll try and get to a few questions here if there are any. Saying no is important. And if you like to say yes, I love you. I'm terrible at this. But the idea, I did say the other day to something, one of my staff are really unhappy with me. He said no. You never say no. Yeah, I know. It was a mistake. But I should say no more. And it's not that we shouldn't do anything. You got to do stuff. And you need to keep the doors open. But it's the idea of being sort of blown by the wind or sailing to a certain point. And there's times for both of those things. But it's really challenging to know when to do that. But saying no sometimes. Stanford would call this the $20 bill test. probably need to adjust that for inflation. But do you leave money on the table for somebody else who can better do that work? And that's a tough one when it's scarcity out there. I think, well, I can do something, but I can't. So is there better use of the resources, both people's resources for this $20 bill or my own time and resources? Can somebody else do better? Or should I be spending my time doing something that's more aligned with my purpose, my vision, my charitable objects, those kind of things? I think we live in an industry where that demand is in arts or human services or research or whatever it might be. The demand for our services will always outpace the supply of resources. I'm an economist, and you have this sort of economic thing, this supply and demand meet, and that's where price stability and market stability sort of happen. We don't have such thing. So to know that there's always more want and always more need for our services, then there'll be resources. And those resources aren't just financial. I think human resources and people stuff is one of the biggest things in the sector right now. Getting enough qualified people. We just finished announcing the biggest merger ever in Alberta, and it was based around people. It was $50 million, an agency that probably couldn't get the right kind of staff to do their work they wanted to do. That wasn't heard of a couple of years ago. A lot of financial, or a few financial, we don't have many mergers, but got more now. But the idea is about people. And so the idea of scarcity and getting the right people to do the work you want to do is a dynamic we're going to be facing for the next little bit here. Smaller organizations tend to overshoot, larger undershoot. Sometimes they conserve a bit more. That's fair enough. There's nothing wrong with that. So just know there's a dynamic based upon where you're at. And one of the ironies is, when we're younger, I think, is that small organizations have a lot of ideas about strategies. And as you get more disciplined, you sort of take those ideas and turn them into strategies. Sometimes large organizations might have strategies, but when they enact them, it's coming back to a collection of ideas because they don't want to push themselves too far. So there's this weird-eyed balance between ideas and strategies that I think I still need to ponder a bit as how that happens. There's a couple of questions. I know if Sandeep has more I can answer. A couple we kind of get is who leads the process. It can be either board or staff. I think it's a blended model. I think this is team game. We've done strategies with just the board and just the staff. Those are never quite the right way. I think a team collective is better. How long does it take? I don't know. But there's a balance between doing it too fast and too slow, the art and science of this thing. I think 3 to 4 months is a nice blend, but depending on how big you are, how complex you are, it can be a little longer. You don't do it in a weekend. You don't want to spend a year because then it's just, oh man, you're grinding this thing out. So you keep the energy going, let the things percolate. Now, how big should it be? We're not writing 50. You can write 50, 100, or 200 page plans. And sometimes they are with a bunch of the background materials, but it's got to be accessible. And so maybe there's different versions. You have a sort of synopsis or an infographic, but it's got to be accessible. Writing a long plan that's a bunch of detail that no one reads is useless. Writing ones that are accessible and usable kind of need to fit you. And do you need outside help? I don't know if you need outside help, but I think an objective voice is really important because it does push us to questions and processes and allows you to participate. Like I do a lot of planning for groups, but I've done it for our own organization too. And if I'm leading inside my organization, I'm probably not speaking my voice as well as I should. So I think that outside help gives you some process pieces and some objectivity. That's all I got. Sandeep?
Yeah, we have a question or a couple questions here from registration. What are some red flags or indicators that we are trying to take on too many goals or objectives at once?
That's a good question. Yeah. I think if you end up with a list of 50, or I've seen organizations have 8 or 10 strategies. I think that's hard to manage. And maybe it's just like, so sometimes on the strategy side, if there's just too many things, if you're pushing yourself too far, if that stake in the ground is getting too far away or too big, that's maybe an indicator. Sometimes it's just an evolution. You find yourself, and this is why I think it's going back to that, taking that solid look at where we're at today. If you do that sort of analysis, that organizational assessment, and go, well, we got 50 programs running right now, and 10 of them are losing money, and only one person in one of them, maybe that's a red flag too. So that's the idea of taking that hard look at where we're at today before we start thinking about the future. But say, do these really fit us? I mentioned that tool called the Sustainability Analysis, and it's a book called Nonprofit Sustainability by Jan Masoka. Easy to find. We can put it and send it out to you if you want. It gives you that discipline to say, does this really fit us? Is this program economically viable and programmatically viable? And you're going to have ones that are sort of better or worse. But if you got something that's losing money and doesn't add much program or sustain or impact for you, then why are you doing it? So I think there's ways to sort of give yourself some discipline to answer that question. Anything else?
I think there is an entry here in the chat.
I saw them before that there are different ways to do pest too. Yeah, pest you can add other dynamics too. There's, environmental stuff like that. There's all kinds of letters you can throw onto it. It's just what are the big buckets of changes out there. So yeah, absolutely great suggestion. Yeah. You have a free
Jared.
facilitator you have to do.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yep,
community
Jared's
development.
short a resource. Yep.
Yeah, so I mean, community development unit is fantastic. The Alberta government does some of this stuff in some geographic communities. They're a little more, there's done in Calgary for some weird reason. But a lot of them with Praise across Alberta, there'll be a community development officer or unit officer that can help do this stuff, generally free. They don't do longer plans, but they can do facilitation and stuff. So there are some great pieces out there. So that's one really good resource out there. Excellent. Well, we're out of time. Thank you so much. Again, lots in an hour. I think I went on and on, but there is lots of stuff out there. Any questions you have, by all means, reach out, and we can always. We're here to help. That's our job. Our job is to come alongside nonprofits, whether it's free workshops like this. We do planning for fee for service, and we have this sort of new chunk in the middle that helps younger organizations sort of figure out their path. What we call the nonprofit evolution lab that we're just starting to roll out today. So, thanks for your time, and Sandeep, I'll send it back to you. Yeah.
Great. We'll go one more
Oh,
slide forward.
there
Yep.
we go.
Okay. So we're excited to share and announce the second offering of our leadership development opportunity, Elevated Leadership. Elevated Leadership is 5 full days of learning delivered as monthly sessions between October 2024 and February 2025. This responsive offering is tailored to you, your organization, and the nonprofit sector. Delivered as a cohort, this is a wonderful opportunity to learn and develop the leadership of self, organization, community amongst peers who have a similar experience. So, leadership development continues to be a need for our sector. This is our effort to bridge this gap and support nonprofit leaders to continue developing and build meaningful relationships within the sector. There is no one way to be an impactful leader. Rather, it's about leveraging your own unique skills and talents. So, join us as we unpack how to do this. For more information, you can head over to our website or feel free to contact me at leadership@integralorg.ca. I'll drop that information here in the chat for you. And you can always give us a call. We are happy to chat and help you and support you in whatever way we can.
Well, thank you, folks.
Perfect. Thank you so
We'll let
much
you
for
go to
attending.
now. So enjoy your afternoon, and we'll hope to see you again soon. Okay.